Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In this lecture, we continue our discussion of slavery in colonial America. And in this lecture in particular, we're going to begin looking at some of the different regional variations in slavery. So slavery in South Carolina, for instance, was very different from slavery in New York or even New England. So we're going to explore some of those regional variations in this lecture. So clearly, when we think about slavery in the colonies, the preponderance of slaves were found in the South. And as we look at this map, it may not be entirely clear, but the darker areas mean there's a heavier concentration of slavery. So we see two real pockets of intense slavery, and even a majority of the population, that is in the Chesapeake area in Virginia and throughout South Carolina. But we should also note that nowhere in the colonies was there a void of slavery. Slavery was to be had in all of the colonies. So what we're going to be talking about in this lecture are the differences and variations within the different regions. So we're going to start with Virginia and that Chesapeake region I showed you on the previous map. And slavery in Virginia really began to escalate in the 1660s. Up to that point, Virginia had used mostly white indentured servants from England, but we see a combination of factors that begins to lead to a preponderance of African slaves. When we think about the decline of indentured servitude, conditions in England began to improve, so fewer and fewer people were willing to sell themselves into servitude for passage across the Atlantic. And so in a sense, the supply of indentured servants began to decline. And as I mentioned a couple of times previously, in 1660, England took control of the slave trade from the Dutch. And so African slaves at that point become a cheaper option, and the supply of African slaves began to grow. Now, for a period, kind of the transition between indentured servitude and African slavery in the 1660s and 70s, whites and blacks in Virginia worked together, drank together, sang together, and engaged frequently in relationships with each other. Black slaves were able to buy their freedom, and once they did, they lived in relative equality with whites. But that period was fairly short-lived. Let me give you just one example to kind of illustrate the flexibility of the institution of slavery in those early years. In 1654, a black slave named John Caesar claimed that he was not actually a slave, but actually was an indentured servant who was held illegally by his owner, a man named Anthony Johnson, who was a large planter. Caesar found himself a white benefactor who helped him take his case to a court in England. Now, ultimately, he lost the case, and Johnson was determined to be his owner. But it shows you a shocking degree of flexibility in the institution that a black slave could even sue his owner in court. In contrast, you would never imagine such a scenario in the antebellum South 50 or 60 years later, for instance. But it's even more surprising, perhaps, to learn that his master, Anthony Johnson, was himself an Angolan, an African who had been imported as a slave in 1621 and had been able to earn his own freedom, became a large planter and owned slaves himself. So that one story illustrates a number of elements of flexibility in the institution of slavery in the 1660s and 70s. But that flexibility begins to erode as African slavery is cemented as the preferred form of labor in the Virginia colony. As more black Africans arrive, as white indentured servitude declines and begins to dry up, and as the threat of slave revolt becomes more prominent, relations between whites and blacks harden. We begin to see more laws on the books forbidding relationships between whites and blacks and making the institution all the harsher. And just as one final reminder, I've discussed a couple of different times the impact of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, which illustrated for a number of different reasons why colonists might prefer African slaves to white indentured servants. Now let's turn next to a discussion of slavery in the Low Country, which refers to the coastal regions of South Carolina. And South Carolina, as a colony, didn't even develop until later than the Chesapeake. South Carolina was founded in the 1660s, but really blossomed in the 1690s or so after rice cultivation became prominent. So in its beginning, South Carolina was a colony designed to feed and supply raw materials to Barbados, which I discussed in a previous lecture. A few industrious colonists thought they could grow wealthy by raising cattle and farming timber in South Carolina. So they moved to South Carolina and brought the practice of African slavery with them. Like the Chesapeake, the Low Country had a period in which white and black worked side by side in relative equality. During this early period, black slaves did similar work to free whites, taking care of cattle, clearing land, chopping down trees, etc. And in fact, some historians have referred to the relationship in this era as whipsaw equality. So if you picture in your mind those kind of large whipsaws that two people use to saw down a tree, so there's one person on each end of the saw, and as you're sawing through that tree, if you get upset with your partner on the other end of the saw, you might whip the saw and the handle could kind of fly up and hit him in the chin. And it was said that either white or black on either end of that whipsaw might whip the thing and insult the person on the other end. Added into the mix was the enslavement of Indians in South Carolina during this period. So for a brief period, an Indian slave trade flourished, which was a particularly abusive system. There were instances of killing the parents to steal the children and sell them, and occasionally there were outbreaks of war and violence between the two sides. But the institution of slavery in South Carolina, like that in the Chesapeake, within a few decades grew much more intense and harsh than those kind of flexible beginnings. Shortly after 1700, South Carolinians discovered that rice grew very well in that climate. And now South Carolina had its plantation crop. And South Carolinians began to import huge numbers of African slaves to work the rice plantations. Growing rice is a very labor-intensive kind of operation. It required vast numbers of slaves to work the fields. So eventually, slavery in South Carolina reaches its horrific apex in all of the colonies. The black slave population becomes a majority of the population in South Carolina. There tended to be less diversity of work on these plantations. Slaves lived in large slave quarters away from the master's house, and virtually all of them worked in the fields, including both men and women. Eventually, what we're going to see, and we're going to talk about some of this in the next few lectures, is that as the number of slaves increased rapidly and again became a majority, the white population grew fearful and restless, particularly of the possibility of a slave revolt. And so they began to pass laws making slavery even harsher, which in turn led the slaves to become even more restless. And as a result, we will see, and again, I'll talk about it in the next few lectures, we will see some slave revolts as a result of this. The last region that I want to talk about is slavery in the North. Now, of course, we all know that eventually there will be a civil war between the North and the South, and that the South, in essence, is fighting for the survival of slavery. But we should not assume that that means that there was never slavery in the North. In fact, there was. As I mentioned previously, there's slavery in all of the colonies from the farthest south to the farthest north. And depending where you were, there might be quite a lot of it in some of these northern colonies. Slaves made up only about 2 to 3% of the population in New England, but between 8 and 12% in the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Rhode Island. So they're still a very important part of society, even if their proportion is lower than that in the South. Slaves in the northern colonies tended to be concentrated in the cities, with the exception of some stretches, particularly in upstate New York, where there were, in some instances, gangs of slaves that worked in the fields. So in the north, they tended to be either house servants or artisans working at a variety of trades. And the typical slave owner only owned 1 to 2 slaves as opposed to perhaps dozens in the South. So this led really to more kind of closer observation of the slaves, closer interaction with whites, and in some cases, a greater degree of acculturation of the slaves. And while they might be less apt to be whipped, and while housework might have been less arduous than field labor, northern slaves were also less likely to be able to maintain their African culture, their language, singing, dance, and rituals, which we're going to talk about again in a few of the lectures to come. As a final note, there were more likely to be communities of freed slaves. As a final note, there were more likely to be communities of free blacks in the North, particularly in the large cities of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where slaves might be freed by their masters for a variety of reasons, or perhaps, particularly in those artisan trades, they might be able to start selling their own wares and accumulate wealth to purchase their own freedom. But you're going to see growing communities of free blacks, particularly in the North. Now, in the next few lectures of this chapter, we're going to move to a discussion of what life was like for the slaves in the colonies. One historian has described slavery as the most traumatizing mass migration in modern history. And it certainly was that. But were slaves completely robbed of their personalities, their culture, their humanity, their dignity, and perhaps even their freedom? We'll discuss those questions in the lectures to come.